I thought a lot about what I wanted to talk to you about, and I'm a person who really shouldn't be doing what he's doing. I grew up in a family of activists. This is a picture 40 years ago, and if you look really hard, you can see my face, my mother's face, and my brother's face. I'm not an architect. I'm not a, by training, I'm not a scholar or a teacher. I found my way into this business in a very unusual and interesting way because I was basically raised to be a person who would live a public life and had an opportunity to do that in the state of Texas at a very young age, and out of that experience decided that the other part of myself that had always been interested in design but wasn't nurtured by my community could express itself in its own form of activism. And so for the last now 23 years, I have been a partner in an architectural practice that is based in the state of Texas. The place where I live is a very interesting place, and it has a series of lessons I think that are important for the entire country to understand because I read about it on the front page of the newspaper almost every day. And it is impossible, I think, to consider the United States of today in a kind of hermetically sealed fashion. I live in a place that has always gone back and forth between two cultures, two languages, and many of you do too. There are more Puerto Ricans living in the city of New York than in San Juan. Los Angeles has always seen itself as the second city of Mexico. Now there are more Salvadorans living in that city than in El Salvador. And in San Antonio, it is a very interesting example of what I call north-south immigration patterns that have created, after 10 years of trying to understand this subject matter, an idea of an imagination that goes back and forth and doesn't know any borders. And that is really important when you are living in a place where they're proposing to build a wall that will separate these cultures from each other. It's not just an economic development issue, it's an issue of the future of this country and the way that communities speak for themselves. It's particularly important to me because I've figured out that design is kind of a contact sport. And in architecture school, they teach you a kind of a purity that you are supposed to aspire to. But the truth of the matter is that design, and quite honestly, the evolution of our country is anything but pure. So I live in what I call now a contact zone, a place that's not so much geographic as it is a place where multiple voices are talking back and forth, negotiating, borrowing and exchanging culturally, socially, and that it seems to me very asymmetrical. In order to explain kind of how I got here, I should tell you that the firm that I run is a very old practice. It has been around for about 80 years, and it has developed its reputation for this kind of beautiful, modern version of Texas regionalism. In some cases it is very modern. In some cases it is private, but in most cases it is an architecture of the public. It has involved adaptive reuse of spaces that were intended for one thing. This is a brewery that has become the San Antonio Museum of Art. In some cases, we have played a part in creating what I call the fantasy landscape of the tourism economy of the city where I live. In some cases, it has involved taking this idea of Texas regionalism and blowing it up in scale from a farmhouse to something that is more significant. In this case, a laboratory, very sophisticated laboratory where they're looking for solutions to some of the most important diseases that are affecting the populations of the state of Texas. In many cases, it's important urban planning projects. This is an expansion of the San Antonio Convention Center that I started working on about 10 years ago and I'm still working on today. And it was the first time that I realized that if San Antonio really was this kind of mythic landscape where people thought, because of the things that we had designed, that it was this idyllic, then I could create my own fantasy landscape if I wanted to. In some cases, even in a place, in a kind of a quiet city like San Antonio, we have played a role in producing some important international architecture. And this is a project I completed about almost 3 years ago now, but this is the home of our NBA basketball team, the San Antonio Spurs, and was really one of the most important community dialogues that I have participated in because it was a project that was paid for with taxpayer dollars. And this really changed. This is an image of a building that we did not design. That on the surface really looks like this beautiful, inexpensive piece of ranch architecture that could have always been there. But it cost about $1,000 a foot. And it is what people usually, that design juries usually look at as being the architecture of the state of Texas. But about 11 years ago, I started thinking about the fact that this kind of design didn't look like me. And it looked like it was discounting a whole segment of the population whose voice needed to be heard. And that made the state of Texas, and quite honestly, the border between the United States and Mexico, very interesting. And in many cases was the cultural lesson, the cultural example that our entire country needed to learn from. And I wanted to understand how you would, at the time, design a Latino architecture, not having gone ever to architecture school, but being in the position of running an architectural business. And so I went to my partner, John Kell, and I said, I think I have an idea for a new architecture. And we talked a lot about how we would decide what that might be, and we turned to the community. Because it was a time when you couldn't ignore any longer the demographic shift of the country. Everybody was beginning to pay attention to it. But if I tried to find it in proper architecture and design, I had a hard time doing it. And so I started to look at folkways, for example, food. I called this, we went on added about 10 pounds to me, but I went on the search for the perfect puffy taco.
What were the results there?
Oh, I haven't found it yet. I'm still looking. Music. There is incredible blended music. The accordion is an important symbol of conjunto music, but it is also an important instrument in German folk music that is such an important part of the Texas landscape. And what really intrigued me was the fact that you found it in both musical forms, and it was an instrument that brought people together. The trucks are big all over Texas, but only in San Antonio and South Texas are you going to find a young girl on her way to a quinceañera and this kind of and I thought the color was incredible.